A REC is a Renewable Energy Certificate, and typically these are a digital or electronic certificate that is going to be housed in an electronic registry account, almost like a bank account. And these represent 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy, such as wind, solar, hydropower, or other qualifying sources of renewable electricity. So the REC markets are longstanding and growing. REC markets date back to the late 90s in the case of Texas and New Jersey. Now we have 30 states plus DC that have what we call renewable portfolio standards. Renewable portfolio standards are really policies implemented on a state-by-state basis that are coordinated by the local power grids as well, or the ISOs, the independent system operators. So PJM, NEPOOL, and many of these state-based RPS programs are coordinated at the ISO level. So a renewable portfolio standard, generally speaking, is a state that is requiring an increasing percentage of electricity sold in that state to come from a qualifying renewable resource. So that could be wind, could be solar, there could be a carve out for offshore wind. These are all implemented on a state-by-state basis, but these are a policy set at the state level, typically implemented by the local utility commission in the state, that require an increasing percentage of the electricity in that state that is sold to come from those qualifying renewable resources. These RPS markets generally are market-based systems. And so for each qualifying megawatt hour of renewable energy in that state, as determined by that specific definition, could be class 1 as a definition for wind, could be solar as a separate carve out for solar, could be biomass, in some cases could be a class 2. And so all these definitions are set at the state level. And for qualifying sources of electricity that meet those definitions, you're issued one of these renewable energy certificates, or RECs. And so for a obligated party in that state, a utility, for example, a retail energy supplier in the state who's selling electricity in that state, they can either meet that increasing renewable portfolio standard requirement from their own qualifying generation resources, or by going to the market and buying a REC from someone who's generated the certificate. One proxy for the size of the REC market would be to look at the total electricity generated in the U.S. coming from renewable resources. Now, not all those sources qualify for RPS markets, but just for example, about 20% of the electricity sold in the U.S. Now, or generated in the U.S., just over 20% is coming from renewable resources. So those are wind, solar, hydro, biomass, a number of qualifying resources. But you look at the total electricity demand or sales in the U.S., it's about 4,000 terawatt hours just over in the U.S., and about 20% of that is coming from renewable resources. Many of the state RPS markets, in terms of potential, are calling for 100% renewable by 10 or 15 years from now. So really that delta between 20% and 100% potentially are a market opportunity for the REC markets. So REC futures have been around since 2009 when the first REC futures were launched at Chicago Climate Futures Exchange, and our team played a role in the introduction of those contracts. Since that time, they've now grown to a very big product set of futures traded on exchange, and at our partner exchange of Nodal, there now are about 4 dozen distinct REC products that are traded. And those are representative of the different RPS markets out there and the different classifications of RECs that exist, different vintages, things of that nature. So they're very specific definitions, for these REC contracts. They're traded like any other futures contract. If you have a futures account with a clearing member and you're a member participant of the exchange, you can trade those products. They're physically delivered futures contracts, so that if you hold the position to expiry in the futures contract, you're going to be making or taking delivery of the underlying RECs in the associated registry account for those RECs. Voluntary RECs in many ways look like other voluntary environmental commodities, like a voluntary carbon offset, from the standpoint that a buyer typically may be buying a voluntary REC for some kind of voluntary sustainability commitment, either a green power purchasing commitment, eliminating a scope 2 emissions footprint for a customer. These are typically voluntary commitments that are being undertaken in the purchase of those RECs. The RECs themselves are coming, generally speaking, from one of the registries associated with one of the RPS markets. So ERCOT, as an example, in Texas, and the Renewables Registry, you may have RECs generated in ERCOT that then are retired for voluntary purposes. What's happened in the market is you've actually had an industry-accepted third-party standard that has evolved over the years. So the Center for Resource Solutions has developed something called the Green E certification program. And so what you'll see is that many of these voluntary buyers that are looking for a voluntary REC to retire on a voluntary basis are going to also look for one that is Green E eligible, that can be certified under that Green E standard. And, that is giving that independent third-party accreditation, for the RECs as well. And so what we typically see on many of our REC futures contracts that have a voluntary component to them are a CRS, listed facility. And so, for instance, in Texas, you'll have wind facilities that generate RECs within ERCOT, and they must actually come from a facility that is on the CRS list as well, meaning that they may be eligible for the Green E standard. And so that has been effectively an evolution of the market to accept, not only Green E as a third-party standard, but also then to take those RECs traded on exchange as a futures contract. And so we've listed that contract, as a new innovation in the market just over 2 years ago. REC markets, from a participation perspective, really started as strictly over-the-counter, bilateral, very bespoke markets. Now they're largely traded, a big portion of the REC markets are traded on exchange as regulated physical futures contracts. That's really opened up the universe of participants as well. And so you've had additional liquidity providers, you've had project developers who are, actually putting, these projects in the ground that can use these futures contracts on a very long-term basis to hedge in these markets. And so it's been a nice mix of commercials and, speculators or non-commercial, players that have, come into the REC markets. And as a result, you've seen liquidity increase. And, I think it's evident there are not that many futures contracts in the world where you have open interest out past 2030, which we do in some of the REC contracts on nodal exchange. So I think that's a very good sign that you have activity that far out the curve and you have open interest out really 10 years at this point. REC markets, in many ways, if you look at environmental commodities, you have at-the-meter tracking of the RECs in real time. You have data. You have these RECs being issued by, generally speaking, state or ISO administrators that are overseeing the power markets in that region as well. So the access to data is very good. The tracking is very good. Other environmental commodities, you're looking at, uncertainty around, did the activity actually happen? The need for third-party verification, things that come into play with other things like carbon offsets. So, I think with RECs, they are a unique environmental commodity. They're certainly growing. I think the market structure from the standpoint of the RPS targets increasing each year as opposed to cap and trade markets having a decreasing cap each year. Inherently, you have a market that's growing each year over year. So, there's a number of interesting kind of dynamics in the REC markets that make it exciting to be a part of.